The cold in the mill had a taste to it, iron and old flour, and Silas Hale stood in the dark before the runner stone, with his palm flat against the granite, turning it the way a man turns a thing he loves and cannot help. The great wheel outside was moving. He could hear the creek working the paddles, the slap and gurgle of Copperford's water doing the one honest thing it knew how to do, and the shaft turning true through the wall, and the stone under his hand answering with its slow, grinding revolution. Everything moved as it ought, everything but the flour. He drew his hand back and rubbed thumb against fingers, and there it was, that faint, hateful grit, fine as sugar and wrong as sin, the thing that had emptied his bins and his account book and near enough his heart. On the doorstep, where he had left it the night before because he could not make himself carry it inside, sat a sack of his own flour come home. Somebody had brought it back on a wagon and set it down and gone away without knocking, which was its own kind of message. He went and hauled the door open on the gray dawn and looked at it. His mark was stamped on the sacking, Hale, Copperford, in the blue letters he had been proud of once. And pinned to the top with a bent 10-penny nail was a square of butcher paper, and on it, in August Reiner's blunt, careful hand, 6 words. Gritty, sours the loaf. Can't use. Silas stood a while in the doorway with the snow smell coming down off the mountains and the light going from black to the color of a dead fire, and he did not curse and he did not weep, because he had done both already, months back, and neither had moved so much as a grain. Reiner was the last of them. Reiner had held on longest, out of old friendship and out of the plain fact that a baker across a river from a mill ought to be able to buy his flour there. And now Reiner was done too. There was nobody left in the territory who would take a barrel of Silas Hale's flour if he set it down free on their porch, and the pity of it, the black joke of it, was that Silas did not know why. The wheel turned. The stones turned. He ground it fine as he always had. And it came out cursed. That was the word. He had heard Mother Mercer say it at her own counter, not knowing or not caring that his Tilda was in the store buying a nickel's worth of salt pork, that the Hale mill had gone bad the winter Anna died, that a mill was like a house and would sour when the woman went out of it. 9 years old, and his girl had carried that home like a stone in her shoe and set it down at the supper table, asking him plain, "Is our mill cursed, Papa?" And he had told her no, and had not been able to tell her what it was instead. He shut the door on the returned sack and went back through the mill in the strengthening light, past the empty flour bins with their lids yawning, past the account book on the shelf by the meal floor that he did not need to open because he knew every red line in it by heart. And he climbed the ladder stair to the little house half of the building, where his daughter was already awake and stirring the porridge with both hands on the spoon. It was thin porridge. He saw that and looked away from it. Thin because the meal was low, and the money to buy more was lower, and because a man who ground flour for a living had somehow come to the pass where he could not feed his own child a proper bowl of it. Tilda looked up at him with her mother's watchful eyes in her small face, and she had a jar in the crook of her arm the way she always did now, a glass jar of clover blossoms pressed flat and gone brown, saved from the last of the summer. And she said, "Is it Mr. Reiner?" And Silas said, "Eat your breakfast." And that was answer enough for both of them. He fed the fire. He watched her eat. And somewhere in the watching he came to the thing he had been walking toward for a week now and refusing to look at square, which was that it was finished. The mill was finished. He would sell it for what the ironwork and the stones and the good oak timbers would fetch from a wrecking man, and he would take Tilda somewhere a man could get honest wages, a rail town, a stockyard, and he would give up the trade his own father had raised him to. And he would do it before the snow closed the passes, because after that they'd not get out till spring, and there was not the meal to see them through a spring. But a man could not sell a mill full of a winter's worth of spoiled meal and cobwebs and the gray felt of old flour on every beam. A buyer wanted it clean. A buyer wanted to see the bones of the thing, the stones and the gearing, not have to guess at them under the ruin. And Silas had not the heart to scrub it himself, to take a broom to the place his father built and his own hands had run for 20 years, to sweep out the last of it like sweeping out a grave. He could not. He would pay someone else to do the sweeping so that he need only stand by and let it be done to him. So he wrote out a notice on the back of Reiner's own butcher paper, turning the 6 words to the wall. Wanted, a woman to clean and scrub the mill, cheap, board, and a small wage, apply Hale Mill. And he walked it into town before the store was rightly open and tacked it to the board outside Mother Mercer's, under the notices for strayed horses and the church social. And Mother Mercer watched him do it through her window with her arms folded and did not come out. And he was glad of that at least. He did not expect an answer soon. He did not rightly expect one at all, for the same talk that had ruined his flour had made the mill a place women crossed the road to avoid. So it was a thing near to a shock when the afternoon freight wagon, coming through on its way to the depot, slowed at the turn to his lane and let a passenger down. And the passenger came walking up the wagon-rutted track toward the mill with a carpet bag in one hand and, held against her body in the crook of the other arm, a crock covered over with a cloth and tied down with string, carried the careful way Tilda carried her jar of clover. She was a lean woman, weathered, past her middle 30s by the look of her, in a plain gray wool dress gone shiny at the elbows and a shawl pinned close against the mountain cold. Dark hair pulled back so tight it might have hurt, silver coming in at the temples like frost on a fence wire. She had a long, plain face that gave nothing away, and she stopped a proper distance off and looked, not at him first, but up at the mill, at the turning wheel and the moss on the north wall and the good line of the roof, looked at it the way a horse trader looks at a horse, and only then brought her eyes down to him. "You'll be Mr. Hale," she said. There was the old country in her voice, faint, a Scotch burr worn down by years of American roads. "I saw your notice. I can clean." He looked at the carpet bag and the crock and something in the set of her, and he said, "It's rough work and dirty. And it's a mill going to be sold. There's no future in the place. I want to be honest about that." She said, "I've no need of a future, Mr. Hale. I've need of board and a dry corner and $1, and I'll earn them." And her free hand, he saw, the one not cradling the crock, was a working woman's hand, brown and hard, the knuckles thickened, and on it the one thumbnail was ridged and dark and grown wrong, an old hurt, the kind a body got young and carried always. He asked her name, and she said, Elizabeth Crow. Bess, and he had opened his mouth to name the wage and be done, to hand her the broom and go back to his ledger of red lines, when she said the strange thing. "When did you last dress your stones, Mr. Hale?" He stood there. The wind came down off the peaks and stirred the flower dust that lived in the grass of the yard. He said, "I beg your pardon." And she said it again, plain, not sharp, the way a doctor might ask a man a question about a pain. "When were your millstones last dressed? When did a pick last go to the faces of them?" And Silas Hale, who had run this mill for 20 years and his father before him, who could set a sluice gate blindfold and knew the sound of every cog in the gearing, opened his mouth and found he did not know what she meant. Dressed? He knew the word the way you know a word in a language you don't speak. Something his father might have said long ago. A thing from the far back of the trade that had gone out of his hands somewhere across the years. The way so much had gone. "I don't take your meaning," he said at last, and it cost him something to say it, to a strange woman in his own yard. And she looked at him a moment with those steady eyes, and then she looked away, out at the mill again, and something crossed her face that he could not read, that might have been disappointment or might have been the opposite of it, might have been a small hard hope she was ashamed of. "No matter," she said. "I'm here to sweep. Where would you have me start?" He hired her. $1 the week and her board and a place to sleep, and if she found she couldn't stomach the work or the loneliness of the place she was, free to go on the next freight and no hard feeling. She set the terms back at him even plainer than he'd put them, that she'd want the loan of tools and a lamp and leave to work into the evening because she liked to see a job clean before she slept. And he said that was fine. All of it was fine. And thought her odd. Thought her more than odd. A woman who came to sweep a mill and carried a covered crock like it was an infant, and asked a miller a question the miller couldn't answer. He showed her the lean-to-room off the meal floor where a hired hand had slept in better years, and she set her carpet bag on the cot and set the crock on the little shelf above it, and she untied the string and lifted the cloth just enough to look inside, once, the way you'd check on a sleeping child, and tied it back down. He did not ask her what was in it. A man learns there are things a body carries that are not his business, and he had his own, God knew, the small carved horse in his coat pocket that had been Anna's whittling for the child before the child came, that he'd carried 3 winters and never shown a soul. Tilda came down the stair and stood at the bottom of it with her clover jar and watched the strange woman from the safe distance of the shadows, and Bess Crow looked over at her and did not smile the way grown folks smile at children to win them, did not crouch and coo, but only nodded at her. One grave nod, woman to woman, and said, "That's a fine jar you keep," and went on unpacking her few things. And Tilda, who had had a year of the town's soft pitying eyes and Mother Mercer's whispers, stood a moment longer than she meant to before she went back up. The short day went. Silas set Bess up with broom and bucket and rag and a cake of yellow soap and the coal oil lamp, and he showed her where the water was and left her to it, and went himself to the sad arithmetic of the account book by the last of the window light, adding again the numbers that would not add to anything but leaving. He could hear her working below him, the swish of the broom, the sound of it moving through the drifts of old meal, steady and unhurried, a person who knew how to work and took no shame nor pride in it, just did it. It was a good sound in a place that had been too quiet. Anna had made that kind of sound moving through the rooms. The light failed. He heard Bess light the lamp, saw the glow of it come up the stair hole. He heard the broom stop. He did not go down at first. He sat with the closed book under his hand and let the dark come into the house half, and thought about rail towns and stockyards and the shape a life takes when you set down the one thing you know. And below him the mill was quiet, and then it was quiet in a different way, a listening way, so that he found himself listening too without knowing what for. He rose and went to the stair hole and looked down. She had swept a wide, clean swath across the meal floor, and the lamp sat on the floor beside her, throwing her shadow big and wavering up the wall, and Bess Crow was not sweeping. She was standing at the great stones where the runners sat quiet on the bedstone, the day's grinding done and the water shut off from the wheel, and she had her palm laid flat on the top of the runner stone, not turning it, not pushing at it, just resting her hand on the cold granite, flat and still, her head bent a little and her eyes gone somewhere far off, the way Silas had seen the horse doctor lay a hand along a beast's flank and go still to feel what was moving underneath, the way a person lays a hand on the chest of someone they love to feel. Is there breath? Is there a beat? Is there anything yet to be saved? She stood so long without moving that the lamp flame steadied and the shadow stopped its wavering, and the whole mill seemed to hold with her, the water murmuring far off past the shut gate, the cold coming down. Her weathered face in the lamplight had lost its guardedness. It had gone soft and grave and terribly certain, like the face of someone who has put an ear to a wall and heard, faint and unmistakable, on the other side of it, a sound that no one else in the house believes is there. The runner stone hung in the block and tackle like a great dark moon that had been pulled down out of its orbit and left to swing, and Bess stood beneath it with both hands raised, not touching it yet, only measuring the way it turned on the rope. She had asked Silas to help her hoist it, and he had done so without a word, hauling on the fall while she guided. And now the 200 weight of granite hung between them at chest height, and she was looking up into its underside the way a woman looks up into the face of something she has known a long time. He had thought she meant to sweep. She had come with a broom in her hand, and a broom was leaned in the corner still, but she had not touched it since the first hour, and Silas Hale stood off to the side with his scarred hand wrapped around a post and did not know whether to be angry or afraid. "There," she said. Not to him, to the stone. She reached up and laid her fingers against the grinding face and drew them slowly across it, and where her fingers passed she stopped and pressed and moved on, reading it, and her mouth went thin. "Smooth as a churchyard slab," she said. "You could skate on it." She turned her hand over and showed him the pads of her fingers, gray with the fine dust she'd raised. "That's your grit, Mr. Hale. Not a curse. Not the creek. Not your poor wife, God keep her." This Silas came off the post because a thing in him would not let him stand still to hear Anna spoken of, but Bess was not being cruel, and he saw that when he got near, and the anger went out of him and left only the fear, which was worse. He looked where she was looking. To his eye the stone was a stone. Round, pitted dark, heavy as sin, the same face it had worn when his father owned it and his father before, the same face it had worn every day of the years Silas had fed grain into its throat and let it run. "It grinds," he said. "It's always ground. It crushes," she said. "There's a difference, and your flower knows it if you don't." She stepped back and wiped her hand down the gray wool of her dress and left a long pale smear there she didn't seem to mind. A millstone doesn't grind by weight. Folk think it does. Folk think you set a heavy rock down on the grain and mash it, and there's your meal. But a stone that only crushes, it bruises the wheat, and it heats it. And the heat sours the germ, and the bruise makes powder and splinter both, and that's grit in your teeth and sour on your tongue, and every baker from here to the roller mills sending your sacks back with a note pinned on. She looked at him. "It cuts, Mr. Hale. A dressed stone cuts. There's furrows cut in the face, and they're worn out of yours down to nothing. Cut so long ago and run so many years that they've healed over smooth. Your stone's forgotten how to be a stone." He did not answer. He was thinking of August Reiner's note. Gritty, sours the loaf, can't use it. He had read it 40 times, and had understood it to be the verdict of the town on a cursed place and a broken man. And here was this lean gray woman off the freight wagon telling him it was a verdict on a worn rock, and that the rock could be mended, and he did not know which was harder to bear, that the thing might be fixable, or that he had sat 3 winters in his ruin and never once thought to look at the very face of the stone. "Show me," he said, and his voice came rough. She took him around to where the light fell better through the broken pane, and she had him kneel with her, which cost his knees, and she took his scarred hand by the wrist, the first time she had touched him, and her grip was dry and hard and businesslike, and she laid his own fingers on the face of the runner stone and drew them across it as she had drawn her own. "Feel that," she said. "Flat, glass, now, here." She moved his hand to the outer edge, to the very rim, where the wear had been less, and there under his fingertips he felt it, the ghost of a groove, a shallow trough cut slantwise, nearly gone but there, the last surviving trace of a pattern that must once have covered the whole face like the veins of a leaf. He had never in his life put his hand there. He had oiled the gudgeon and greased the spindle and mended the launder when it leaked and cursed the wheel in the deep of winter, and he had never once laid his palm flat to the grinding face and asked it how it fared. "That's a furrow," she said. "There was 100 like it once. Cut in a pattern, we call it the harp, or the sickle dress. My father cut the herringbone, and every one of them's an edge, and every edge shears the grain as the stone turns over it, shears it clean, and lifts it out to the rim cool and whole. Scissors, near enough, 1,000 little scissors turning in the dark. That's what a mill is. That's what you had, and it wore away under you a straw at a time so slow you never marked the day it died." She let go of his hand. "Stones want dressing every few months, worked hard. Yours hasn't been touched in how long?" "I don't know what you mean by dressing," he said, and heard how it sounded, and did not care, because it was true. "My father did to it what my father did. I never saw him at it. He'd shut the mill a day now and again, and I'd be sent to the far field and told to stay. And I stayed." He looked at the stone. "I thought it was the way of it. Shut a day. I never knew what he did in here alone." Bess was quiet a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, gone lower, and she was not looking at him but at the stone, and he understood that she was seeing another mill and another man. "My father did the same," she said. "Sent us out. It's close work, and a man wants it quiet. He'd come out at dusk, gray to the elbows with his hands bleeding, and he'd not say a word, and the next morning the meal ran white and cool, and my mother would bake, and the whole close smelled of it." She stood, her knees cracking. "It's not a mystery, Mr. Hale. It's a craft, and a craft dies when it's not handed down, and yours died the day your father did, and never told you. That's all your curse is. A man died without saying a thing out loud that he'd never thought to need saying." Silas stood too, slowly, and put his scarred hand on the cold stone and left it there, and did not trust himself to speak. "I've the tools," Bess said, brisk again, turning to the carpet bag she had set on the meal bin. "My own. My father's, near enough. I had them made to his patterns after he was gone. If you'll give me your leave to dress the stone proper, I'll do it. And you'll grind a sack of clean flour by week's end, or you'll owe me not a penny of the dollar." She was unwrapping the oilcloth as she spoke, and it fell open across the meal bin, and there they lay in their pockets. The mill picks, the bills, the short heavy hammers with their 2 hardened points, a proofing staff, a paint-worn little tin. Bright honest iron, kept oiled, kept ready, carried God knew how many miles in the bottom of a bag by a woman no miller would hire. He looked at them, and he looked at her, and the whole strange afternoon came down on him at once. The returned sack on the step, the empty account book, bleeding its red columns, Tilda at the table this morning spooning up thin porridge, without complaint because she had learned not to complain, and this woman he'd meant to pay $1 a week to push a broom standing over a set of stone dresser's tools that had crossed a continent looking for a stone to mend. "I've nothing left to lose," he said, so I'll not pretend I'm doing you a kindness by saying yes. But yes, that's the only honest reason there is, Bess said, and picked up the first pick. The dressing took the rest of that day and 2 more, and it was not gentle to watch. She set the runner stone down face up on a bed she made of grain sacks and old planking, hoisted and lowered by the block and tackle with Silas on the rope taking her direction. Slow, slow, hold, down now, and once it was down and steady she knelt to it and did not rise for a long time. First she took the proofing staff, a straight-edged board she rubbed with the lamp black from the little tin, and laid it flat across the face and turned it. And where the black smudged off onto the high spots of the stone she marked them. And so she read the whole face for its lies, the places worn proud, and the places worn hollow, because a stone that grinds true must be flat as still water, and Silas's was warped as an old floor. Then she picked up the pick and began, and the sound of it filled the mill and did not stop. It was the ring of hardened iron on granite. A small bright tap struck over and over, thousands of times, tens of thousands, each blow lifting a fleck of stone no bigger than a grain of sand. And she worked in lines, following the old worn ghost furrows where she could find them, and laying down new ones true where the old were gone, cutting the herringbone her father had cut, the long slanting cracks marching across the face in ranks like a field plowed by something patient. Chips of granite stood in the air. The dust of it settled on her dark hair and turned the silver at her temples to full white and settled in the creases of her knuckles, and Silas saw within the first hour that her hands were bleeding, small cuts across the backs of the fingers from the flying stone, and he brought her a rag, and she wound it round and kept on. Her bad thumbnail, the one that had never grown right, she'd wrapped in a scrap of leather before she started, and by the second day the leather was worn through. "You'll ruin your hands," he said. They were ruined at 9 years old, she said, not looking up, striking. This is only keeping them company. He could not stay away, and he could not bear to only stand. So he made himself useful in the small ways she'd allow, bringing her water, holding the proofing staff, turning the great stone when she needed it turned, and mostly just being there in the cold mill with the light going gold, and then gray in the broken pane while the iron rang. He had thought the mill a dead place. It did not sound dead now. It sounded like something being made. Tilda came on the second afternoon. He had not brought her. She came on her own, drawn most likely by the ringing, and she stood in the mill door in her too big coat with her jar of pressed clover held against her chest the way she held it everywhere. And she watched. Silas started to send her out, the flying chips, he thought, but Bess spoke first without stopping her work. "Mind your eyes from the front of the stone, and you can stay," Bess said. "Come round behind me, where the chips fly off away from you. That's it. That's a girl." And Tilda went round, careful, and settled on an upturned pail behind Bess's shoulder, and watched the pick rise and fall, and after a while, when Bess reached without looking for the lamp-black rag, and it wasn't at her hand, Tilda saw it lying by the tin, and picked it up and held it out. "There's a good hand," Bess said, and took it, and their fingers touched, and Tilda did not pull away, and Silas, standing by the post, watched his motherless daughter hand a strange woman a blackened rag, and felt something turn over in his chest that he had kept still and stopped for 3 winters. He turned to the window so neither of them would see his face. It was on the evening of the 3rd day that Bess set down the pick for good. She stood and stretched her back until it cracked, and looked a long while at the face of the stone, which was no longer the smooth, dark churchyard slab it had been, but a thing alive with pattern, the herringbone marching clean across it, every furrow a shadowed edge, the whole face true and flat and waiting. She ran the proofing staff across it one last time, and read almost no lie in it now. Then she nodded once, to herself, the way a person nods who has finished a thing exactly. "Hoist her back," she said. They set the runner stone home on the spindle, and Bess spent the better part of an hour with her ear near the works, setting the gap between the stones by feel and by a fineness Silas could not follow, close but not touching, for stones must never kiss. And then she opened the crock. He had wondered about the crock since the freight wagon. She had carried it off the wagon herself and would let no one else lift it. A squat covered crock she kept swaddled and warm, and she had set it near the little stove in the mill house corner and fed it he did not know what. And now she took the cloth off it, and Silas smelled it. A smell sharp and sweet and living, like cider and new bread and something older than both. "My father's," she said, seeing his face, or its great-great-grandmother was, a sourdough mother, kept alive and fed since his kitchen in the old country and his father's before, and it's crossed the water and the whole breadth of this country in that crock, and I've fed it your flour these 3 days to see." She looked at him. "It didn't like your old flour. Soured wrong, went flat and gray. A mother tells you the truth about a grain." She patted the crock. "We'll ask it again tomorrow." But first they would grind. Silas fetched a half-bushel of his own wheat, the same wheat that had made the gritty sour flour that came back on his step, and he poured it into the hopper with his own hands, and Bess let the water onto the wheel. And out on the creek the old paddles took the weight, and the whole mill woke. The shudder up through the floor, the deep, patient groan of the gears, the runner stone beginning to turn over the bedstone in the dark, and the grain running down out of the shoe into the eye of the stone, into the newly cut furrows, into 1,000 little scissors turning true for the first time in 20 years. The meal came out at the rim. Bess caught the first of it in her cupped palm and did not look at it. She felt it, closing her hand around it and opening it and letting it fall and catching more. And her weathered face did a thing Silas had not seen it do. It eased, all the way, the pride and the guard going out of it. And for a moment she looked young. She held her hand out to him without a word. He put his fingers into the meal in her palm. Cool, it ran cool through his fingers where his old flour had come off the stone warm and scorched. Cool and fine and soft as nothing. No grit, no bite of sand, only a silk that poured off his fingertips and drifted down, and he rubbed a pinch of it, and it was flour, true flour, the flour of his boyhood, the flour Anna used to bake with in the first years before ever a sack came back on the step. And he stood there in the shuddering mill, with his hand full of his own cool, clean flour, and he could not see it any more because his eyes had filled. And he did not wipe them. And Bess had the grace to look at the stone and not at him. "That's your ruin, Mr. Hale," she said quietly over the sound of the wheel. Turned, it was never your grain. Tilda came and put her small hand into the meal too, between theirs, and laughed to feel it, the first sound of that kind Silas had heard from her in longer than he could name. And the 3 hands sifted the cool flour in the fading light, while the stone he'd thought was cursed turned honest above them. That night, Bess fed a good measure of the new flour to the mother in the crock, and mixed it with water and a pinch of salt, and worked it under her cut and bleeding hands into a small round dough, and set it on the shelf above the mill house stove where the warmth would reach it, and covered it with a cloth. Silas banked the fire. Tilda had fallen asleep on the sacks with her clover jar, and he carried her home to her bed, and came back, because he could not stay away from the mill tonight of all nights, and Bess was still there, sitting by the stove with her ruined hands open in her lap, watching the covered dough the way she'd watched the stone. "It'll rise by morning," she said, "if the mother's happy." And I think she's happy. She looked over at him. You'll want to be here to see it." He said he would. He fed a stick into the stove and sat down across from her, and neither of them said much else, and the little doe sat warm on the shelf between them in the dark, swelling by degrees too slow to see, taking its living breath from a mother 100 years old and a stone 3 days mended, rising toward a morning that had not yet come. The mill smelled of scorched flour still, but under it, faint and rising, was something else. A warm, living smell that had no business in a place the town called cursed. Bess had the small loaf balanced on the flat of her hand, turned it once to catch the lamp, and set it back on the shelf above the wheel pit, where the warmth of the running water kept the air from ever going full cold. All night it had climbed against the cloth. Now she peeled the linen back and stood looking at it the way a woman looks at a thing she has waited a long time to see happen twice. "That's not the same flour," Silas said from the doorway. He had come down before the light, meaning only to check the head race, and found the lamp already lit and her already at work, and the smell had stopped him where he stood. "That can't be the same flour I've been grinding." "It's your grain," Bess said. "Same wheat from your own bins." "It was never the wheat, Mr. Hale. I've been telling you." She lifted the loaf and laid it on the deal board she'd scrubbed white the day before, and took up the long knife, and there was a moment where even she seemed to hold her breath. The knife went through clean. No drag, no grit catching on the edge, only that soft parting sound and the little rush of steam out of the open crumb. She turned the cut face toward him. He had ground flour his whole life and his father before him, and he knew what a poor loaf looked like inside. Tight and gray and mean, gummy near the bottom where the bad meal wouldn't rise. This was open and pale gold, the holes even and glistening, the crust gone a deep brown that crackled when she pressed it. It looked like bread out of another man's oven. It looked like the bread that used to come out of his own kitchen when Anna was alive and the mill was whole. Tilda had come down the stairs in her nightdress with the quilt still around her shoulders, drawn by the smell same as her father, and she stood halfway down, clutching the rail, staring at the loaf as though it were a lamp lit in a dark window. "Come here," Bess said, gentle, and the child came. Bess cut a heel off the end, the corner piece with the most crust, and she went to the crock on the sill where she kept a little pat of butter cold from the creek, and she spread it thick so it melted straight down into the warm crumb, and she put it in Tilda's 2 hands. The girl bit into it. She chewed, and her face did a strange thing. It crumpled, not from any hurt, and her eyes filled and spilled over, and she didn't make a sound, only stood there eating and crying at the same time, the butter shining on her chin. Silas went down on one knee in front of her, alarmed. "What is it? What's the matter?" "It tastes like Mama's," Tilda said, and could not say another word, and turned her face into his shoulder with the bread still gripped in her fist. Silas held her and looked over her head at Bess, and Bess had turned back to the board and was very busy with the knife and did not look at either of them, and gave them that. He understood then a thing he had not let himself think in 3 winters, that the mill going bad and the sour bread and the thin porridge had taken from his daughter one more small piece of her mother, the taste of a fed morning, and that this quiet stranger had reached back and got it and put it in the child's hands. His throat closed. He pressed his mouth to the top of Tilda's head and held on, and did not trust himself to speak, and the wheel turned on the creek outside, and the loaf steamed on the board, and, for the first time in a long time, the mill was warm all the way through. By the time the sun was well up, he had made up his mind. He wrapped a whole loaf in clean cloth, and he took a 2-pound sack of the remilled flour off the fresh run and tied its neck, and he told Bess he was going across the river to Reiner she said. It wasn't a question. She knew already whose note had come pinned to the returned sack. He turned me away a year gone. Sent my flower back with a word on it I couldn't argue. Silas looked at the sack in his hands. I don't rightly know what I'll say to him. Say nothing, Bess said. Let him taste it. Bread argues better than a man does. He went down the bank and across the plank bridge where the creek ran into the wider river, and up the far side to Reiner's bakehouse with its stovepipe already smoking, and he stood a moment outside the door gathering himself before he pushed it open. August Reiner was at the trough with his sleeves rolled, red to the elbows in dough, and he looked up and saw who it was, and his face shut like a drawer. Silas, careful. Not unkind, but braced. If it's about the flour, I told you plain. I can't be baking loaves that turn to sand and go sour on the second day. I've a name to keep. Folks come to me for bread they can eat. I know what you told me. Silas set the sack on the end of the bench and unwrapped the loaf beside it and did not make his case. Only did what Bess had said. He tore the loaf across, the crust snapping under his hands, and the smell of it went up warm into the flour-dusted room, and he held out the torn half. Just this. Then I'll go and not trouble you. Reiner looked at him a long moment. Then he wiped his hands down his apron and took the half loaf, more to be rid of the thing than anything, and he brought it up to his nose the way a baker does without thinking, and something changed in his face. He turned it in his hands and looked at the crumb, at the even open holes and the color of it, and he pulled a piece loose and put it in his mouth and chewed slow. He didn't say anything for a while. He walked to the window with the bread in his hand and looked out at the river and chewed and swallowed and tore another piece and ate that too. When he turned around, his red face had gone strange and quiet. Where did you get this? Ground it myself. Yesterday, off my own stones. Silas nodded at the sack. That flour there made that loaf. Nothing else in it but flour and water and salt and thyme. No baker's tricks. That's what my mill's putting out now. Reiner untied the sack and put his hand in and drew out a fistful of the flour and let it run off his fingers, and Silas saw him feel for the grit that wasn't there, saw his brows go up when it ran cool and smooth off his skin like water. He rubbed a pinch between finger and thumb and smelled it and tasted it dry off his fingertip. This is not the flour you were selling me. It's the same wheat. The stones were the trouble. They'd gone smooth as glass, and they were crushing the grain and scorching it instead of cutting it clean. That's your grit. That's your sour. Silas found, saying it, that he believed it wholly now, that Bess's words had become his own. They've been dressed proper, cut back the way they're meant to be. I hired someone who knew how. Someone, Reiner looked at him. A woman. Her father was a miller in Scotland. She knows stones. He said it plain and waited for the laugh, because he'd have laughed himself a month ago, but Reiner only looked back down at the loaf in his hand and shook his head slowly. I've bought flour out of Minneapolis, out of the big roller mills in the cities, patent flour, white as chalk. Reiner set the bread down careful as if it might break. This is better than any of it, Silas. I'll say that to you straight, because you were straight with me. This is the finest bread flour I've had come through that door since I left Chicago as a young man. It has. He searched for it. It has a taste. The city flour's got no taste at all, just white. This tastes like the wheat. For a moment Silas let himself feel the whole warm weight of it, a year of shame lifting off his back in one breath. Then he saw Reiner's face pull down again, and he braced, because he knew that look. It was the look of a man about to tell you a hard thing. I can't buy it. August, Hear me. I want to. If it were only me and only this bakehouse, I'd take every sack you could grind and glad of it. Reiner spread his flour-white hands. But 3 months back, a man came up from the roller outfit downriver, the Cascade Mills, you'll have heard the name, and they've contracted me. Cheaper than I can grind myself, cheaper than any water mill can go. They ship it up by the wagon load, bleached white, and it's steady, and it never sours, and it costs me next to nothing. I signed my name to a year of it. I've the paper in the drawer. He looked genuinely pained. And there's the other thing. And you know it better than I do. The talk. Half this town won't buy bread they know came off Copperford flour. Mercer's been telling it up and down the road a year now. The cursed mill, the bad luck on it since Anna passed, God rest her. A man's wife dies, and his flour goes bad the same season, and folk make a story of it. You could put the best flour in the territory in front of them, and they'd not touch a loaf of it because of what they've decided to believe. Silas stood with the torn loaf between them and had no answer, because it was all true, every word. "I'm sorry," Reiner said, and meant it. "It's a beautiful loaf. It's the best flour I've handled in 20 years, and I don't see how you sell a sack of it in this valley." He walked back across the plank bridge with the empty cloth folded in his coat and his mind gone heavy and dark, and he told Bess all of it, standing in the mill with the wheel turning, the roller contract and the cheap city flour, and Mercer's talk and Reiner's honest sorrow. He expected her to go quiet and beaten. She heard him out with her arms folded and her head a little on one side, and when he'd finished, she nodded once, slow, like a person adding a sum and finding it came out about where she'd figured. "So the bread's not the argument," she said. "The bread was never going to be enough by itself. I should have said." She went to the hopper and ran a little grain through her fingers, thinking, "Sit down a minute, mister. Hale. There's things about your own mill you don't know, and it's time you did, because you're going to have to be able to say them to people, same as I'm saying them to you." He sat on the flour bench, and she stood over the stones and told him. She told him the roller mills broke the grain between steel cylinders and sifted out the bran and the germ, the little living heart of the wheat, the part with the oil in it. Because the oil went rancid, and the bran was dark, and what they wanted was white flour that would keep on a shelf a year and ship 1,000 miles and look like snow. They take the wheat and they take the life out of it, and what's left keeps forever because there's nothing left in it to spoil, she said. It's flour that's already half dead. That's your cheap white flour. That's what he's shipping up the river. And the stones? The stones grind it whole and cool. Bran, germ, all of it. Ground fine together the way water-driven stones have done it 1,000 years. She laid her flat hand on the great runner as she'd done that first dusk, a doctor's hand on a chest. "That germ's what you tasted in that loaf. That's what your girl tasted. It's what Reiner can't get out of a barrel of city flour for any money. Because it's not in there, they took it out. Your flour keeps the whole grain in it. That's not the mill's weakness. That's the one thing in the whole valley the roller outfit can't make and can't ship and can't fake." She looked at him. "You've been thinking these stones ruined you. These stones are the only thing that can save you. It was never the grain, and it was never bad luck, and it was never your poor wife, God keep her. It was 2 stones gone smooth from 30 years of grinding and a man too heartsick to see it, and I've fixed the one and you're mending from the other. That's the whole of the curse." He sat with that a long while. That night, after Tilda was asleep, he had the account book open on the table by the lamp, and Bess sat across from him mending a rent in the flour sack cloth by the same light. And it was easy, in the small circle of the lamp, to say things a man wouldn't say by day. He totted the columns and told her the truth of where he stood, how far behind, how few weeks he could carry it, how the bank in the county seat had already sent one letter he hadn't answered. She listened and did not flinch from the numbers. "How is it you came to this?" he asked her at last. "A woman drifting the roads with stone tools in a carpet-bag. It's not. I don't mean it unkind. It's just there's no other like you I ever heard of." She was quiet, drawing the needle through. "My father was a master miller, Aberfeldy, in Scotland on the Tay. He'd no sons that lived, only me, and he was a stubborn old man, and he taught me everything he'd have taught a boy because there was no boy to teach. Dressing the stones, keeping the mother going, reading the meal off the run by the feel of it." Her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "He kept that same sourdough alive 40 years. Fed it every day of his life. When the coughing sickness took him, it was the last thing he set me to. Feed the mother, girl, don't let it die. So I've kept it alive across an ocean and half a country. It's the one thing of his I've got left that's still living. And you go from mill to mill. I go where there's a stone wants dressing." The needle stopped, which is nowhere long. "There's not a miller between here and the Missouri will believe a woman knows a runner stone from a bedstone. I tell them what I can do and they laugh, or they take offense, or they let me sweep and pay me off and send me on. I've dressed stones in the dark for men who took the credit in the morning. I've been turned off a place with a good week's work behind me because the man's wife didn't like a woman about the mill. She took up the needle again. So I don't say much anymore. I let the work say it. It's slower, but it's surer. A man can argue with me. He can't argue with a good loaf and a stone that runs true." Silas looked at her across the lamp, the dark hair silvering at the temples, the calloused hands, the bad thumbnail she'd earned honestly at a trade the world wouldn't grant she had, and he thought that he had hired her for $1 a week to sweep out a ruin he meant to sell for scrap, and that she had walked in with her dead father's tools and her living crock and given him back his mill, his daughter's mourning, the taste of his own dead wife's kitchen, and a reason, and that he had not yet said one word of thanks that came anywhere near it. He opened his mouth to try. Boots on the plank bridge outside. In the dark. More than one man's tread, then a fist on the mill door, heavy and sure of itself, the knock of a man who has never once wondered whether he'd be let in. Bess set down her mending. Silas rose and took the lamp and went and drew the bar, and the cold came in around a stranger in a good town coat, clean-shaven, a second man hanging back behind him in the dark with a lantern. "Mr. Hale? Silas Hale?" The man put out a hand and a smile, neither of which Silas took. "Name's Corliss. I represent the Cascade Milling Company, downriver." His eye went past Silas into the warm lamplit mill, over the fresh sacks stacked by the stones, over the woman standing at the table, and something in it sharpened even as the smile held. "Word's got down the valley you've had a bit of a revival up here. Fine flour, they're saying. Fine bread." He let that sit. "I've come to talk business with you, friend, and I'll be honest. I think you'll want to hear it. Because the way I see it, a man in your position, well, there's an easy road out of your troubles, and there's a hard one, and I'd surely hate to watch a good man take the hard one." The first snow came down before dawn, and Bess was already awake. She had lit the mill house stove and set 2 loaves to their second rise, and now she stood at the small window, watching the flakes come slow and fat out of a sky the color of skimmed milk. The creek beyond the wheel had gone quiet at its edges, a thin lace of ice creeping in from the banks toward the black water in the middle. and the great wheel turned through it steady as ever, throwing up a fine cold spray that froze where it landed and hung from the paddles in little glass beads. She had seen 100 first snows in 100 cold kitchens, and none of them had ever felt like standing still. This one did. This one she had a reason to want the day to come. Silas found her there when he came down, and for a moment he only stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and looked at the snow the way a man looks at something he half expected to grieve over and finds he does not. The mill was warm behind them. It smelled of yeast and cut oak and the faint, sweet dust of good flour. And that smell had done more to change the shape of his face in 3 weeks than anything Bess had ever watched work on a man. "It'll close the pass by week's end," he said. But he did not say it like a doom. He said it like a fact a man could plan around. "Then we've this week," Bess said, "to make them remember us before the roads shut." He looked at her. "Make who remember us?" "Everybody who can still get across the river." She turned from the window and wiped her hands down her apron, and there was a plan already sitting behind her eyes, plain and unhurried, the way her plans always came. You can't argue a town into a thing, Silas. You can't stand in Mother Mercer's store and tell folks the mill's not cursed and the bread won't sicken them. The more you say it, the surer they are you're hiding something. So you don't say a word. She nodded at the loaves rising under their cloths. "You feed them." He frowned, not against her, but around the idea, turning it. "Feed them how?" "The church social's Saturday. Reiner told you himself. Half the valley'll be in the hall, and the freight stop runs the other half through by the smithy waiting on the last wagons before the snow. We bake through the night Friday, every scrap of flour we've got. And we give it away. Give it." He stopped. She watched the miller in him wince at the word, the man with the account book bleeding red, and she let him feel it a moment because he needed to. "You've been selling flour nobody trusts," she said, gentler. "You'll give away bread nobody can refuse. There's the whole of it. A man'll turn his nose up at your sack all day long. He won't turn it up at a warm heel of bread with the steam still coming off it, not with his children watching. He'll take it because it's rude not to. And then he'll taste it." She let that land. The taste does the arguing. It's the only thing that ever could. Silas was quiet. Out the window the snow thickened, and the wheel groaned and threw its frozen spray, and somewhere above them Tilda's small feet crossed the floor and came down the stair. "All that flour," he said at last, "given off. And nothing back." "Something back," Bess said. "Just not coin. Not yet." She met his eye. "You've been ruined a year, Silas Hale. You can afford to be generous for one night of it. It's the cheapest thing you'll ever spend." He looked at her a long moment, and then he almost smiled, and he put his hat on. "My father would have called that throwing good grain after bad." "My father," Bess said, "would have called it seed." They baked Friday from dark to dark. Bess had them start the sponges before noon, the great crockery bowls lined along the warm shelf where the mill house wall backed the stove, and she fed each one from the mother, and the kitchen filled up with the living smell of it, that faint, winey tang that meant the whole thing was awake and working. She had Silas hauling flour from the fresh-milled sacks, the flour that ran cool and silken now off the dressed stones with no grit in it and no scorch, and she had him at the trough kneading with his sleeves shoved up over those broad flour-pail arms. And it turned out the man's hands knew the work better than he did. Some memory in them, maybe, from a boyhood at his own father's trough, before the mill went sour on him. She corrected him twice, and then let him be. Tilda would not go to bed. She sat on the flour barrel with her jar of pressed clover in her lap and watched, And when the first pans went into the oven, built into the mill house chimney she came, and stood at Bess's elbow so close Bess could feel the child leaning, just barely, the weight of her against Bess's hip like a cat testing whether it would be allowed. Bess did not make anything of it. She only handed the girl a bit of dough scrap and showed her how to roll it thin and lay it on the hot stone at the oven's mouth, and how it would puff and blister in a minute into a hot flat cracker. And Tilda ate 3 of them and got flour clear up to her eyebrows and fell asleep at last against the warm bricks with her clover jar held to her chest. And Silas carried her up. He came down and stood in the doorway a while, watching Bess turn the loaves. The snow had stopped. The world outside had gone white and silent and enormous, and the mill was a small, warm-lit thing in the middle of it, and the wheel turned on. "She hasn't slept like that," Silas said low, "since her mother." Bess didn't answer that straight. "Some things you honored best by not putting your hand on them." "She's a good watcher," she said. "She'll be able to true a stone before she's 12, if you let her learn. You'd teach her that. I'd teach her that." He came into the room then and took up the peel and began drawing the finished loaves out of the oven, laying them along the cooling boards, dozens of them, their crusts crackling as the cold air met them. And neither of them said the thing that sat plainly in the room between them, that this was what a mill sounded like when it was alive, 2 pairs of hands and the fire and the smell of bread, and that it had not sounded like this in this house for 3 winters, and that she was the reason. By first light they had near 70 loaves cooling, and Bess wrapped them warm in every cloth and clean sack they owned, and loaded the wagon while the sky went from gray to the hard, bright blue that only comes over new snow. The church social took them like a held breath. They came in stamping and cold, the whole valley it seemed, farm families and the timbermen and the freight crews come off the last wagons, and there was the long table with the pies and the pickled things and the coffee steaming, and there at the end was Silas Hale, who folks had not seen in company since God knew, standing behind a mountain of bread and cutting it into thick, warm heels and holding them out to anybody who'd take one, saying nothing, only, "It's fresh this morning. Take it while it's warm." They took it because it was rude not to. Bess had been right about that. She stood back by the wall, with her hands folded in her plain gray wool, and watched it happen exactly the way she'd said it would. The way she'd watched it happen once before in a valley in the old country before the coughing sickness took her father and took the mill and set her drifting. A man would take the bread with his face already made up to be unimpressed. He'd take it to be polite to the widower. And then he'd bite it, and Bess would watch the small change come over him, the little pause, the way his chewing slowed, because it was good, it was better than good. It was bread the way their mothers had made it, before the roller mills came in and stripped everything out and gave them back white dust that rose fast and tasted of nothing. It tasted of wheat. It tasted of the germ still in it and the flavor still in it and the slow water-ground stone that kept what the steel threw away. It tasted like something remembered. Mother Mercer came for the pie table and stopped at the bread instead because everyone was crowded there, and Silas, God help him, held a heel out to her before he saw who it was. And there was a terrible small silence, the woman who had told the whole county the mill was cursed, standing in front of the miller's bread. Bess watched her take it. You could not take it, with 40 people watching. She took it the way you'd take a coal off a fire. She held it a moment. And then, because she was cold and it was warm and it smelled of everything good, she ate it. Bess saw the exact moment. She saw the woman's chin work, and saw her eyes go somewhere far off for a half a breath, and saw her come back, and Mother Mercer said nothing at all, which from Mother Mercer was the loudest thing she could have done. She set her jaw and moved off to the pie, and Bess let out a long, slow breath through her nose and thought, "That's one. That's the one that matters." August Reiner found Silas near the end of it, when the bread was down to crumbs and the last of it gone into freight men's coat pockets for the road. Reiner had a heel of it in his big red hand still, and he was looking at it, and not at Silas. "You know what you've got here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Bess has got it," Silas said. "I only turned the crank." Reiner looked past him then, found Bess at the wall, and gave her a short nod that was almost a bow, one craftsman to another, and Bess felt something in her chest she hadn't felt in a long many years and didn't fully trust. Reiner turned back to Silas. "I've a contract with the Halvorsen Roller outfit downriver," he said heavily. "You know that. I signed it a year back when your flour went to grit, and it's cheap and it's white and it ships regular, and my customers took to it because they didn't know better." He turned the heel of bread over. "They know better now. Half of Copper Ford's just tasted the difference, and come Monday, they'll be in my shop wanting to know why my loaf doesn't taste like the one they had at the social." He blew out a breath. "So I'll tell you what I'll do, and it's a fool's thing and my wife'll skin me. I'll take a load off you. A real load. Enough to bake my week on. And I'll put a card in the window says Copper Ford Stone Ground, and I'll let the Halvorsen contract run out and not renew, and God help us both if this goes wrong. Because that outfit does not lose gracefully." Silas put out his hand, the scarred one. Reiner took it. "It won't go wrong," Silas said. "It might," said Bess from the wall, and both men looked at her. She came off the wall and folded her hands. "Best you both know that going in. A man who ships cheap and loses a whole town's custom in a week does not shrug and move along. He comes back at you. So we'd best be strong enough by then to stand it." Reiner looked at her a long beat. "You always this cheerful?" "I'm this honest," Bess said. "It wears the same coat." And Reiner laughed, the big red laugh of him, and it was the first time in a year that anyone had laughed in the same room as Silas Hale's flour, and Bess saw Silas hear it, and saw him stand up that half-inch straighter he'd been finding lately, and thought, "Good. Let him. He's a while yet from believing it, but let him." The load went to Reiner Monday, and the town turned that week the way a wheel turns, slow at the start against all its weight, and then, once moving, hard to stop. It was the farm wives that did it, in the end, more than Reiner's card in the window. They'd tasted the bread at the social, and their own risen loaves at home had gone flat and sour by comparison, and one by one they came to the mill. Not to the store, to the mill, driving right up over the packed snow to the door, and they came shy, and they came for the flour, but what they really came for, once they'd got there and stood in the warm and smelled it, was the mother. Bess had known they would. She'd known it since the old country. There is a thing that happens to a woman when she tastes bread that lives, that has a wildness in it the fast yeast doesn't, and she wants it in her own kitchen, wants to be the one who keeps it going. And Bess did not hoard it. That was the thing Silas could not understand at first, and came to understand later as the shrewdest thing she did. She gave it away. She spooned a little of the mother into a clean crock for any woman who asked, and she stood at the trough and showed her how to feed it, morning and evening, flour and water, how to keep it warm through the cold, and how to tell when it was hungry by the smell of it, how it would live forever, if you only remembered it. "You're giving away the very thing they'd pay you for," Silas said one evening, watching another wife drive off with her crock cradled in her lap like Bess's own carpetbag had cradled it off the freight wagon that first afternoon. "I'm giving away a start," Bess said. The start's nothing. It's the flour keeps it fed, that's the thing. And there's only one mill in this valley grinds flour good enough to keep a mother strong through a winter. She wiped down the trough. Give a woman the starter, and she's yours for the flour the rest of her life. She'll drive past the store and past the roller freight and come here. Because her mother lives on your grain now, and she won't feed it anything less. That outfit downriver can undercut you a penny a pound till judgment, and they'll never sell that woman a sack again. Because you gave her a thing they can't. You gave her a living thing. She hung the rag. You can't buy loyalty, Silas, but you can feed it. Same as bread. He looked at her across the warm, flowered room, at this lean, weathered woman with the silver coming in at her temples and the bad thumbnail and the plain gray dress, who had walked in off a freight wagon with one bag and a crock and given him back his mill and his daughter's sleep. And now, God help him, the beginnings of a living. And he opened his mouth to say some part of what was moving in him and found he had no practice at it and shut it again. Bess pretended not to notice. It was a kindness she was good at. By the end of that second week, the orders were coming from 2 towns over. A man drove 12 miles through the snow from Ashfork because his sister at the Copperford Social had sent word, and he wanted 4 sacks and a start of the mother for his wife, and he paid coin, real coin. And Silas wrote it in the account book in the black column and sat looking at the black figure a long time as though it were written in a language he'd forgotten how to read. And Tilda was a different child. She'd taken to shadowing Bess through the whole of the day, and Bess had begun, without ever announcing it, to teach her. Small things. How to sift. How to tell the cool, good flour from the scorched by nothing but the feel of it running through her fingers. And one bright, bitter afternoon, with the light coming hard off the snow through the mill window, Silas came in from banking the head race and found the 2 of them kneeling on the floor by a small hand quern, an old, worn, broken thing not worth the hauling out, and Bess had a fine little stone pick in her hand and was showing the girl how you laid the proofing staff across the face and rubbed the lampblack on and turned it and read where the black marked high, where the stone still needed cutting to run true. And Tilda had lampblack to her wrists and her tongue between her teeth in concentration, and she was truing a stone, 9 years old, the way Bess's own father had shown Bess in a kitchen an ocean and a lifetime away. Silas stood in the door and did not say anything for a while. She's got the hands for it, Bess said without looking up. Better than her father, if I'm honest. I'll not argue it, Silas said, and his voice came out rougher than he'd meant. And Tilda looked up and grinned at him with lampblack on her nose where the flour used to be. And something in the man's face came the rest of the way open, quiet, like a door that had been stuck all winter, finally giving. He came and knelt down with them on the cold floor in the hard, bright light, this broad, stooped, flour-pail man, and he put his scarred hand out, and Bess set the little pick into it, and she guided his big hand and the girl's small one both. And the 3 of them turned the stone and read the black and tapped the granite true. And the wheel turned outside in the frozen creek, and the mill was warm, and for a while there was no ruin anywhere in the world, and no roller mill downriver, and no woman who'd spent her whole life being told a woman couldn't dress a stone. There was only the ring of iron on granite, and the smell of bread, and the 3 of them on the floor. Which was, of course, exactly when the trouble came. It came in a good coat and good boots, driving a fast light rig up over the snow with a matched pair that had no business on these roads, and it did not knock. It walked into the warm mill with the cold blowing in behind it and stood looking around at the sacks and the crocks on the shelf and the account book open on the desk with its new black figures. And it took off one glove, finger by finger, and smiled at Silas Hale the way a man smiles who has already decided how the conversation ends. "Mr. Hale," the roller mill agent said, "I hear you've had a run of luck." He looked at the flour, and at Bess, and at the child with lampblack on her nose, and his smile did not change, but something behind it took a careful measurement of all three. "I've come to talk to you about your future." The first snow had made the mill a lantern in the dark, and inside it the account book lay open between them, its red columns beginning, for the first time in 3 winters, to run black. Silas closed it slow. He set his scarred hand flat on the cover and looked at Bess across the flour-dusted table. And for a long moment neither of them said the thing that had been standing in the room all evening. Her carpet-bag sat by the door. She had brought it down from the loft after supper without a word, and the sight of it there, buckled and waiting, had sat in his chest like a stone all through the tallying. "You mean to go?" he said. It was not a question. His voice came rough. "Work's done." Bess folded the cloth she'd been holding, corner to corner exact, the way she did everything. "Stones are dressed and true. You've a starter that'll outlive us both if you feed it. Reiner's got his load and there'll be more. You don't need a broom hand any longer, and I was never much of one." A thing crossed her weathered face that might have been a smile if it hadn't cost her so. "I drift, Mr. Hale. That's the shape of my life. I set a mill right and I move on before the miller decides he ought to have done it himself. That's not." He stopped. He was a man who had spent 3 years choosing silence over words, and the words came to him now clumsy as a boy's. "That's not how it went here." "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." The lamp guttered. Out on the creek, the wheel turned its slow, cold circle, and the whole building hummed around them, the good low hum of stone running true that he had not heard in this mill since before Anna took sick. A sound he'd stopped believing he would ever hear again. And here it was, all night, every night, because of the woman buckling her bag by his door. He got up. He crossed to the window where the snow came sideways through the light and stood with his back to her because it was easier, and he made himself say it plain, the way she'd taught him to dress a stone plane, no flourish, only the true cut. "When you first came," he said, "you asked me when I'd last dressed my stones, and I didn't know what you meant. I thought the mill was cursed. I thought I was cursed. Mother Mercer said it, and the whole town said it, and I believed them, because it was easier to be cursed than to be a man who'd let a good mill go to ruin out of grief and never once thought to look at his own stones." He drew a breath. "You looked. First hour you were here, you laid your hand on that runner stone like you were feeling for a heartbeat, and you found one in the stone. And his voice caught. He let it. In me, I think. I don't know how else to say it. Behind him he heard her go still. That particular stillness of hers, the one she'd had that first dusk with her palm on the granite. "I'm not asking you to keep house," he said, turning. "I want that clear, because you've been asked wrong your whole life, by men who wanted your hands and not your name. You dressed these stones. You brought the mother across an ocean and a dead father's kitchen, and you fed it my own ruined flour to test it, and you woke this place up. That's not broom work. That's not $1 a week." He came back to the table and stood over the closed book. "I want your name on it. On the deed. On the sign out front. Partner. Honest and plain. Before God and the whole gossiping town. Hale and Crow. Because the half of this that's worth anything, you built with your own bad thumb." For a moment Bess said nothing at all. Then she looked down at that thumb, the nail gone wrong from a boyhood of labor she'd never had, only a girlhood of it, standing on a crate beside a Scots master miller who wouldn't live to see her make good. And Silas watched her jaw work, watched the pride in her go rigid the way it did whenever a thing threatened to be given rather than earned. "You don't have to make it charity to make it fair," she said at last, low. "I'll not have you carve my name in for pity of a drifting woman." "Pity?" He almost laughed, and the sound surprised them both. "Bess, you've watched me these 6 weeks. Have I the coin or the character to give away $500,000 out of pity?" He shook his head. "It's not charity. It's arithmetic. You did half. You get half. Your father would have told me the same, and cuffed me for taking so long to see it." That reached her. He saw it land. The mention of the old man, said not as a wound, but as a plain honoring. And something in her weathered face gave way by a hair's breadth, the first crack in a wall she'd carried mill to mill for 20 years. "He would have liked you," she said, unsteady. "He'd have said you were slow, but you weren't a fool. That's near the highest thing he gave a man." She pressed the heel of her hand quick against one eye and took it away again. Composed, exact. Bess, all right. "Partners. Name on the deed." "I'll yes." They shook on it across the table, her calloused palm and his scarred one. The way 2 millers seal a thing, and it should have ended there and been enough. And for a fortnight it did. And it was. Then came the evening in the depth of winter, when the work was caught up and the last wagon had groaned off up the snow-packed road, and it was only the 2 of them and Tilda asleep in the house, and Silas found he could not let the plain arithmetic be the whole of it any longer. She was truing a small stone at the bench, one of the little querns he'd started keeping for Tilda to learn on, running the proofing staff across its face and reading the lamp-black marks with her head tipped, and the lamp caught the silver at her temples, and he stood in the mill door with the cold at his back and the warmth of the mill room on his face, and knew the thing entire. Bess, she didn't look up. Highside's still here. By the eye. Feel it. She held the staff out to him without turning, and he came and took it, and their hands crossed on the worn iron, and he did not let go when she would have drawn back. "I want to say a thing wrong," he said, "and I'd be obliged if you'd let me get through it before you tell me I'm slow." Now she looked up. The lamp was between them, and the stone was between them, and all the flower dust of the day hung gold in the light, and her dark eyes were steady on his, and wary, and something underneath the wary that she'd kept locked so long she'd likely forgotten it had a key. He set the staff down. He put his scarred hand flat on the face of the little stone, on the fresh-cut furrows she'd taught him to read, and he said it in the only language he had left that told the truth clean. "I know how to keep a hearth now, because you taught me the mill was never cursed, only left. I don't want to be left again, and I don't want to leave you standing in a cold room, truing stones for men who won't say your name." He swallowed. "I'd have you keep my stones true the rest of your days, Bess Crow, and I'd keep your hearth warm, and I'd stand in front of Reiner and Mother Mercer and the whole of Copper Ford and say the woman who saved this mill is my wife. If she'll have a slow man who took 3 winters to look at his own stones and 6 weeks to look at her." His voice went to almost nothing. "I love you. I didn't think I had it left in me. You woke that up too." The staff clicked on the bench. The wheel turned. Somewhere in the walls a beam settled with the cold. And Bess Crow, who had drifted from mill to mill for 20 years, with one carpet bag and a living crock and never once been asked to stay as more than a pair of hands, put her bad-thumbed hand over his scarred one on the stone and pressed down, so that both their palms lay flat on the humming granite together, and she said, "Yes, you slow, dear man. Yes, he kissed her there in the mill room, with the flower gold in the lamplight, careful and unpracticed and sure, and the stone hummed under their joined hands like a thing alive, and neither of them let go for a long while. Spring came the way it comes to that high country, all at once and stubborn, the creek breaking its ice with a crack you could hear from the house, the cottonwoods going green along the water, the road drying to ruts a wagon could trust again. And the wagons came. They came from Copper Ford and from across the river, where August Reiner had torn up his contract with the roller mill outfit and told the agent to his red face that a man who'd tasted true flour couldn't go back to the bleached and chalky stuff and sleep at night. They came from the 2 towns down valley, and then from beyond them, freighters asking after the Copper Ford stone ground by name, and the roller mill agent who had promised to shutter Silas and spread word the mill's bread would sicken folk had packed up and gone down river for good, beaten not by a price war, but by a heel of warm bread that argued better than any man could. Silas repainted the sign himself, on a bright cold morning with Tilda holding the pot and Bess calling the letters true from the yard. Hale and Crow, it read now, in fresh black on new plain board, and beneath it fine stone ground flour. He'd wanted her name equal size to his, and had made the painter do it over when the man tried to letter it smaller, and Bess had stood in the yard with her arms crossed and her chin up, and let him, which was its own kind of yes. Mother Mercer came out at last in April, on the arm of nobody, stiff with her own long unkindness, and stood in the mill door where she'd spread the cursed talk for 3 years. And she looked at the 2 dressed stones running clean, and the shelves of good flour, and the loaf cooling on the sill, and she said, gruff, that she supposed she'd been wrong, and she supposed she'd take a sack, and she supposed a jar of that mother if it was truly being given. Bess gave her both, and taught her the feeding of it standing right there, patient and exact, the way she taught them all, and did not once say a hard word about the 3 years, and that mercy, Silas thought watching, was the last curse lifted from the place. For that was how the empire grew, and it was a golden one, though not in the way the roller mill men would ever understand. It grew in kitchens. Bess's mother's starter, the living thing she'd carried across an ocean from a dead man's hands, lived now in a dozen crocks, and then a score of them, up and down the valley, the Reiner bakery and the parson's wife, and the freight stop cook, and the far homesteads where women who'd never had a loaf rise proper now pulled gold from their ovens and fed a bubbling crock every morning and called it. Some of them, the Crow mother, never knowing they honored a Scots miller dead of the coughing sickness in a country they'd never see. Gold flour ran silken and cool and gritless through 100 hands. Gold loaves cooled on 100 sills. The ruined flour that had come back to Silas's door with a note pinned to it, gritty, sours the loaf, can't use it, had turned, truly and past all telling, into a thing that fed a whole valley and made a poor stooped widower a man of standing, and made a drifting woman a wife with her name on the deed, and made a motherless child whole. That was the last of it, the sweetest part, and it needed no ledger. Tilda, 10 now and no longer wispy, came flying up from the creek one dusk in early summer with flour on her nose and clover in her fist for the jar she still kept. And she called them both. She'd started it in the spring and never stopped, and neither of them had corrected her, because neither of them could bear to. She called back over her shoulder, Ma, Pa. The bread's near ready, Ma says come, running the words together the way children do. And Bess in the doorway with her hands floured to the wrist did not flinch at the name the way she had the first time, but only wiped her hands on her apron and smiled the smile that had cost her so much that first night and cost her nothing now. Silas came in from the yard. The mill hummed behind him, that good low sound of stone running true. Quiet now for the night, but warm still, flowered and alive. He crossed to where Bess stood, and the loaf sat golden on the sill in the last of the light, and Tilda leaned into her mother's side, and Silas laid his scarred hand flat on the cooling stone by the door, out of a habit he'd never lose now, feeling for the heartbeat that was always there. And Bess laid her bad-thumbed hand over his, the way she had the night she said yes, the two of them palm to palm on the granite in the failing gold light. The melancholy that had haunted the place gone out of it entire, worn away clean like the glaze off a well-dressed stone, and the mill and the man and all of them running true at last.